Hello, Eyal. How are you?
Very good.
Can you see and
It's a
hear me okay?
Saturday morning. I hear you very well. Yeah,
Good, good.
it feels like we, you know, just spoken a few weeks ago, a few days ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we should let the audience know that we aren't actually strangers to each other, that we do know each other separately.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's nice to see you.
Yeah.
Um, what's that picture behind you, by the way? Is that the Church of the Spilt Blood?
This
The
is
picture on the wall
actually
behind you.
it's a poster by a friend, Sasha Brodsky, one of the paper architect, the Russian paper architects.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and it's one of the exhibitions that was still, I believe, took place during the time of the Soviet Union when architects like him that kind of withdrew from dissident architects that
Mm.
somehow wanted to withdraw from what they conceived as what my wife Ines Weizman called the total meltdown of the Soviet system. Withdrew into kitchens and were drawing um, fantasy architecture. Um, the idea for them was that architecture should not be part of the productive economy, should not be part um, of the support of the state structure, and that there is another
Mhm.
kind of more fantasy dimension to it that should never be built because the world as it was, and they didn't imagine that the world that they were living in is just about to end. Uh, imagine we
Yeah,
live at the end
yeah.
of the Cold War. Our imagination is not really seeing around corners. No, it kind of seeing continuity, and they just thought architecture arrived to its end as a possibility of building, of making, of supporting um, economies and regimes. And to a certain extent, it's a reminder for me. And again, this kind of belongs to my wife's sort of body of work, but that architecture has other potentials than serving a client, uh, becoming a
Mhm.
commodity or property, etc. Something I was trying also to exercise in my work.
Have you ever heard of that? Talking of the end of the Soviet Union, have you ever heard of that book, which is called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More? And it
I
describes
did, yeah.
the last few moments of the Soviet Union when the whole thing suddenly overnight collapsed. It's very interesting to me because it shows you how fast those changes can be in a society. We always sort of expect rather long, gradual processes that we've seen coming from a long way in advance, but actually things can happen overnight. And there's a very interesting part in that book where he says major social changes happen in two stages. The first is when everyone realizes things are wrong, things aren't working right any longer. But the second is when everybody realizes that everybody else has also realized that. So the second is when you realize that nobody has confidence in the whole system, then things change. And that's sort of what happened in the Soviet Union, I think. um, this sudden switch into a realization that we weren't in the world that we had been telling ourselves about. We were in a different world.
Yeah, and I guess it's pretty apt for the situation where we are. No, I mean the also the organizers ask us to think about the future, and obviously we can only think about the future as a kind of a gradient of the present, going, you know, radiating on the same wavelength, but further out. So it's very interesting to look to think. Maybe that is kind of an interesting subject for a conversation about radical shifts in history, about those hinges that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Take also the Arab Spring, for example, uh,
Yeah.
self-immolation in Tunisia, an incident one incident in uh, in one country of an entire region, all of a sudden creates an effect that is completely contagious. So ideas are like the virus also, but history needs those kind of doorways. It needs those incidents that fold into themselves potential futures. And I think it's really interesting to look at those triggers. What's in them that allow us to imagine things differently? Is it just the outrage of somebody burning themselves in a main square? Is it something else? How does it spread? And I think that, this is also a moment that Precious and I were discussing, the relationship between the long duration, kind of an, sort of long player conception of time, sort of endlessness almost, and the incident, sort of what's in the molecular level of time that can affect that sort of long duration. And I think somehow for me, there's something in your music that does that. Certain tones that become hinges and kind of open up a different evolution of a certain kind of tonal sequence, for example. I don't know if you see that at all as relevant.
Yes, so I'm sometimes losing a few words that you're saying, but I think I know where you're going. So for me, those incidents have to be very easy to communicate and very easy to describe, because then everybody can take a position in relation to them. They are sort of, for instance, the guy burning himself in Tahrir Square, that sort of started the Arab Spring, was a trigger, a moment which everybody could see, everybody could talk to each other about. So in a sense, those have to be very specific, visual, easily describable incidents. Everybody knows about them and everybody can take a position in relation to them. And to me, that's a little bit like the way artworks operate. They present you with something that you can share, a lot of you can share, and you can look at as a cultural moment and say, how do you feel about that? What's your position in relation to this? It enables people to take a position in relation to a known entity, if you know what I mean. It's not like reviewing a long philosophical argument, a polemic of some kind. It's, what do you think about this incident? I mean, I can remember when I was young, one of the key questions to art students of my age was, what do you think about Jimi Hendrix? And what that meant was, where are you on the line of experimental music? Are you with him or are you not? And I think a lot of historical incidents that act as triggers are of that kind. It's very easy for you to locate yourself in relation to them.
I think that for us also in forensic architecture, we have a kind of an intellectual diagram, if you like, when we engage with incidents, with particular cases. And we call it the long duration of a split second. So it comes to really resolve two, let's say, historiographical model. That is how we understand history, how we understand our relation to time. So let's say in the mid 20th century, what was very much in fashion amongst historians was what was called the history of the long duration, the longue durée, the history that people were writing historical books that described periods that were longer of a human, the duration of a human life, the history, like Baudel's, the history of the Mediterranean over, a millennia, yes, etc. Then the response to that was what was called microhistory. So people like Carlo Ginzburg were looking at the life of a particular individual in a small Italian town, late Middle Ages, and trying to reconstruct around it the kind of the world of which it was part. And I think that for us, we're inspired by both those historical conceptions. When we are looking at an incident, say an act of police killing, so we spend usually upwards of a year, say a year and a half, looking at 1 second.
Mhm.
I think that the second that in which Mark Duggan was shot in North London in August 2011 is 1 second. From the moment he left the minicab on which he was driving to the moment he was shot by a policeman, is one of the biggest gaps, one of the most important gaps. 1 second is a gap in London history. But around that gap
Mhm.
of 1 second, did he hold a gun in his hand when he stepped out of the minicab? Thus, according to the police, shot rightfully. Or was he unarmed when he was shot? And therefore, this is another of the police murders.
Mhm.
Is something that around that gap, the entire relation of us living in the city, of the relation between, North and South, East and West London, um, race and social relation in town are kind of revolving around that. So I think that when you dig into the molecular level of time, the more you zoom in to the smallest molecules of time, you find the um, the long duration. So, and I'll give you kind of one example on it. So, at the end, when you have shown, whether it is in our investigation of Mark Duggan, the killing of Harith Augustus by the Chicago Police Department, or the killing of Musa Abul Kiyan in Palestine by Israeli police, at the end, when you show the police that you know that they've killed an innocent person, they would say it was a split-second decision. It was a mistake. It was simply an instinct that we thought at the heat of the moment that that person was posing existential danger. And then you would ask yourself, why is it always and again that Palestinians are being mistaken as existential danger by Israeli police? That black pedestrians in Chicago are mistaken as existential dangers, imminent danger by Chicago Police Department. And in that instinct, you find the entire history of slavery, of
Yes.
segregation, and of the racial nightmare in which we are. And I think that that kind of interscalar relation, that you have to dive into the absolute small in order to find the vast, is a diagram that I think exists for us, but I also see it in your music, in a way in which through a particular sound and tone, you get into somehow the kind of infiniteness of some of your compositions.
I watched your Mark Duggan piece the other night, actually, and it was extremely interesting, I must say. But what was also interesting were the comments from people underneath, which made it very clear that they didn't understand that a moment could be freighted with so much history and background. A lot of people were saying, but that doesn't mean he was racist, or these kinds of comments. They were sort of dismissing the piece as though you were extrapolating far too much from what you had seen in that 1 second. Do you know that famous piece by Steve Wright called "It's Gonna Rain"? Have you heard that?
I heard of it, but
it's a tape. Yes, it's a very interesting piece because it's just a tiny little loop, about 1.5 seconds long, of a preacher, a Chicago preacher, saying, "It's going to rain, April. It's going to rain," and they've looped it, so it's very fun. "It's going to rain. It's going to rain. It's going to rain," like that. And what's really interesting about that is that as you listen to this tiny moment of time repeating, you hear the whole history of Black American experience in America, both the kind of pain and rage and frustration in his voice, but also this feeling of we can find glory. He's a gospel preacher, you know. So at the same time as you feel all of the anguish and the agony of the situation, you feel the sense of hope and we can make it. You know, the great message of gospel music is everything's going to be all right. That's why we like gospel music, because that's what it's saying. And to hear that voice sort of saying everything's going to be all right is a very piquant sort of mixture. And so I'm quite tuned into this. I mean, as you know, I'm a big forensic architecture fan, and I'm very tuned into this idea of looking at the moment to see the big picture, going down to the atoms to see what the whole chemistry is like. What I would like to see is that we extended our ways of looking at history in both directions. So we do the Fernand Braudel huge picture of how a society works from the granular to the huge level, but we also do the microscopic level too. At the moment, it seems that all of conventional history is stuck in one band in between those two. I can think of some very nice exceptions. I don't know if you know that John Keegan book called The Face of Battle.
No.
It's a very, very, very interesting book. He looks at three British battles, famous British battles, which are Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme. And he describes the experience of an individual soldier in each case, what they would have been wearing, what they would have eaten, what would happen to them if they were injured, what their clothes were, and suddenly going into the details of that, again, opens up a whole world picture in each case. So I think I always say of history, you know, if we're teaching history in school, I would always think the best thing would be to start from here, you know, say to the children, we're now going to do history. Go and talk to your parents. Find what the world was like when they were young. And then find out what your grandparents, how they lived. Sort of work backwards from where we are now, not start with the Romans or the Egyptians or the Greeks and work forward. Start from here and work outwards, if you like. It's a different way of thinking about things. You could do that with every school subject, with geography. Start from here. Let's start our geography in the school playground.
And let's see how the world is folded in the playground. I mean, where the material from the playground coming from, what economy, what labor relation, what kind of form of exploitation or other kind of fossilized actually within the objects that we cover. I mean, to a certain extent, it's a kind of Marxian sort of idea of the fetish, you know, that in a sense, the commodity fetish is two things. It's both that which, you know, generate desire as something, as a product to be bought, as a luxury product perhaps, but it also in there's relation between so many people and their minds that have been mined in order to produce the steel for that. We are working now with another human rights organization called ECCHR in Berlin on the issue of European export for arms in Yemen. So what we're doing is we're taking one bomb, a particular bomb. I don't want to mention which one it is because we haven't yet published. And we're looking at it, we say this single object is an assembler. It's a composite object that is produced by several hundred components, each one of which is produced in a different place in Europe, a different kind of industrial estate just outside one of the major or minor cities in Europe. The material from each one of those come from, you know, several raw material providers. So the size of that bomb is the world folded into that bomb.
Yes.
Now that
Yes.
bomb lands in a place, on a hospital, say it's thrown by a Saudi Eurofighter jet, fallen on a hospital in Yemen, and it breaks again.
Mhm.
Breaks again, not exactly in the same arrangement of the things as they've been produced, but in a way that approximates them. And those fragments burning and flying faster than the speed of sound are tearing flesh and buildings and medical equipment, etc. And in a sense, what you have is a kind of, you assemble the world into an object and then disassemble.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
this is where, you could enter a history of the world or political reading through one object. And an object like the moment in Tunisia, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, or like the moment in art, is, to understand it, you need to see the world of which it is part. And I think that this is, to do that. There is an interesting category that is now being used or popularized by really fantastic anthropologists called Anna Tsing. It's written a beautiful book on mushrooms, Mushroom at the End of the World. And she calls that.
Oh yes, I have. That's a great book. Yeah.
You've read it, yeah?
Yeah,
So,
I know that. Yeah, yeah.
So she speaks about something called interscalar vehicles. And of course, to say that something is, you can trace back and you can build a relation that are fossilized into it is one thing. But you need to travel along very intricate and intelligent interscalar vehicles. What actually connect that mushroom to the economy of its circulation, to the labor, that kind of. So you need to do that work, and that work is really important. And that work requires us to think differently about scale. The traditional way of thinking about scale, let's look at architectural ways to say, here is the scale of the room. I'm an interior designer. Here's the scale of the house. I'm an architect. Here's the scale of the street. I'm an urban planner. Here's the scale of the city. I'm a politician, whatever, no? And that's a modernist way of thinking about scale. But sometimes you need ways to short circuit it and build from the vast to the small directly. You don't want to go through all those stages. And so it is also with time. And I think that in history, we learn about it chronologically, as if every period gives birth to the next one. No, it's a very sort of humanistic conception of time as succession. But in fact, sometimes to understand that moment here, you need to go directly to the Roman period, to another, and the jumps could be much wilder. And
yes. In fact, you must read, if you haven't done, a book that was published in the 60s by an artist called Daniel Spurry. I think he was a Swiss artist. He wrote a book called The Topology of Chance, or maybe The Topography of Chance. And it starts with a picture of his dinner sitting on the table. It's just a picture of a plate with some food on it. And he traces the history of each piece of food and of the plate and of the clay that made the plate. So the book is exactly what you're talking about. It's a kind of explosion back in time to how all of these things arrived on his plate. It's a fascinating book. And it reminds me of something else. When I was in my 20s, I got very interested in conspiracy theories, in how people constructed conspiracy theories. I mean, at the moment, we have an amazing one in this QAnon thing, which is possibly the maddest global conspiracy theory ever to appear. But I got interested in the Kennedy assassination because there were so many theories about what happened before the moment of the assassination and about what happened straight after it. So you saw this picture of all of these different routes that led to this one incident, which we had on film with the Abe Zapruder film. So the one incident, like the guy in Tahrir Square, was clear and defined and photographed from quite a few angles, actually. But leading to it were all these different theories about how these men had got onto the grassy knoll and how this person was here and that policeman was on his bike there. All those different threads somehow resolve into that one moment. And then what happened afterwards? Lee Harvey Oswald ran away. This policeman was there and he shouldn't have been. These whatever. So I got this picture of history being defined by a few specific moments, like the guy in Tahrir Square, the shot that killed Kennedy, a few other things like that. But the rest of it being a sort of network of speculation, of different theories about what could have happened and what didn't happen and what may have happened. And I think what's fascinating about your work is that it looks back into that net, that web, and says, okay, well, if that happened there, then that must have happened over there at the same time. So therefore, those two things kind of cross-verify each other. This is very interesting to me, that looking into the murk of speculation and starting to fix a few things together, starting to build a fabric. And one of the musical ideas I had coming from that was to wonder whether you could make a piece of music that was not a single identifiable, precise being, but was a sort of set of possible musics. And at any moment of listening to it, you were hearing one expression of that set. You were hearing what this particular moment would produce in that set. But in fact, there were several other parallel existences that could also happen. You know, this is this generative music thing that I've been talking about for a long time,
Yeah.
To everyone's intense boredom. The idea of creating a structure that produces music rather than specifying the music itself, specifying the machinery that produces the music, machinery in the conceptual sense. Sorry, that's probably not very clear. I'm aware of this clock counting down.
No, I think that what is really helpful in this description is that also in our conception, you know, the facts are like the tip of icebergs. You know what you see, but you don't know what is the shape underneath it. And you need to understand, and you need to always take into account that there are multiple ways in which those facts that we see, the moment the trigger is pulled, the moment of escape, those things that we know, could be connected in almost infinite ways. The problem of conspiracies is that they say there is one way in which it is done. It's my way. It shows that these people are evil, these bankers, this whatever group. There's always a group of Freemasons, Jews, whatever, no, that are kind of behind them. Whereas the beauty, and also the beauty of the way you describe the piece, is that there are infinite multiple ways, and you need to keep all those infinite multiple ways in which those tips of icebergs could be connected, and to imagine the contours of the reality underneath them, I suppose.
Yes. Are you hearing quite a loud noise of a kettle boiling or something?
I don't know why. Just today, right out of my window, a compressor is starting to, I was really. But that's also speaking about our time, no? That kind of like all the roads are being dug up, and because fewer people are driving along them.
Yeah, it's a conspiracy, obviously. Now, I think we're supposed to finish very soon, but I'll go on a little bit longer. Nobody's telling me yet to stop. So the Duggan story that you told, when is that now publicly available for everybody? The Duggan movie that you made.
Yeah, I mean it's been published widely, and it's been submitted to the IOPC, the police watchdog in the UK, who is taking it and reconsidering the investigation. So what they've written us in response to that is that they are considering to open that investigation. I think that would be absolutely the right thing to do, because I think so much of the trust and social, political, racial fabric of London has been torn in that moment. And a way to amend it is to resolve that 1 second in this history that includes so much in it. Of course, it's not only Mark Duggan. The sort of racial nightmare in which we live is ongoing and much wider. But within that, we need to engage it as part of an entire system. Then there's also the work that we are.
I think we've run out now. So good work and good luck with the Duggan thing and everything else you're doing. Nice to see you.